Next, from Springfield, we talked to State Representative Frank Mautino, who is leaving the legislature after 25 years to become the state's Auditor General. This runs about 20 minutes.
Representative Frank Mautino, and I will say one of the most popular men in the Capitol. Thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Depends on which day you catch me, but today's been pretty good.
Well, as we stand here, a number of people are going by and congratulating you, and that's why we're talking to you. You are going to be leaving the legislature after some 25 years and become the new Auditor General of Illinois. And there you go, another pat in the back, a lot of well-wishers. How did it come about that you are going to be the new Auditor General?
Well, we've been very fortunate in Illinois to have Bill Holland, a man of great integrity, as our Auditor General for the past 23 years. He had just received a 10-year term 3 years ago and decided earlier this year to retire, and we're proud to have had him. He's done a great job. Over his 23 years, he served with integrity, and he was very much bipartisan, or nonpartisan is probably a better term, as a good example of how that office should be run. When he decided to retire, that opened up the search for a new Auditor General to be the third Auditor General since our 1970 Constitution. And I've served on the Audit Commission for 18 years. Since the last 12 years I've been the chairman. So I've had the privilege of working with Bill and his tremendous staff for since 1997. And I thought it's a wonderful position.
Did you put your hat in the ring, or did someone call you up and say you ought to apply for this?
No, I actually tossed my hat into the ring. I resigned as the chairman of the Audit Commission, and then made application and joined a host of other applicants. They did a nationwide search, and the Audit Commission itself conducted interviews from people who had different backgrounds, but some very, very high quality people. And I was fortunate to receive their recommendation to serve as the next Auditor General.
People often think there's only 6 constitutional officers. There's 7, and the 7th is the Auditor General. That is just not an elected office, it's an appointed office. But for how long of a term is it?
It's a 10-year term, and it is the 7th constitutional officer. It is selected in our 1970 Constitution. What they did was take this position and create it and require a supermajority of the House and Senate members to select the next Auditor General. That makes you be nonpartisan. You have to go out and get support from both parties and both chambers in order to go forward and fulfill a 10-year obligation.
Why did you want to be the Auditor General, and what is your idea of the job? I mean, how do you see the performance of the job?
The Auditor General is really the only true, he's the only truly independent set of eyes on state government finance, on programs and operations. The Auditor General goes out and checks to see how the state agencies, the General Assembly, the other constitutional officers are fulfilling their obligation to both state, federal law, and to the taxpayers. The 10-year term gives you a lot of independence because you outlast current administrations, and the fact that you have to get a supermajority of the House and Senate members to support you means that you won't be partisan and you won't take a partisan role, but actually just be there to make sure the dollars are being spent the way they were supposed to be spent.
The way you look at the job, is it merely to account and say you were given so many dollars and you spent them accordingly within the, or would you also look and say, you haven't done anything wrong from a legal standpoint, but you're running a very inefficient operation?
We can point out inefficiencies, and the Auditor General has throughout his term, not only inefficiencies, but also fraud, misrepresentations. And when that occurs, General Holland, General Cronson before him, have always referred those matters for prosecution if it was criminal, or if we find something that's not being run as it should be, then it's the duty of the Auditor General to report back to the legislature. And the legislature, being the policy-making body, makes those changes.
You know, I really don't know to what extent you have authorization to look at different books. When we look at, say, the Chicago Public Schools, it's not a part of state government, but they get state support. Can you look at their books as well, or are you limited to state agencies?
State agencies, any monies that are spent from state dollars, we can be asked to and requested to look into from the General Assembly by resolution, or actually by the Audit Commission itself. They can pass a resolution. Now, for non-state entities, for example, the great audit that was done on the RTA, CTA, MET, PACE, those, since they are not a specific state agency, can be done by agreement with those units of local government, but those units of local government would have to agree to the audit, agree to cooperate, and agree to pay for it. We don't do individual school districts. They have their own law for auditing and are already required outside auditors. But in the case of College of DuPage, the Auditor General's office did go in and do a report and do an audit for it with agreement and sign off from those members of the trustees in College of DuPage and with their agreement to pay for it, so the Illinois taxpayers did not have to pay that bill.
Yeah, and we'll get to some other issues, but the general population, I think, they look at so many different people that have come out and been exposed for corruption one way or another. Do you think that your office, the new office you will take, and by the way, let's say, when do you actually, if you're still a member of the House right now, when do you officially become the Auditor General?
Mr. Holland is going to be retiring on December 31st, and I'll officially take office January 1st.
Have you reviewed how much money the Auditor General has, how much staff, and whether or not you think you have enough resources to do the job the way it should be done?
As the chairman of the Audit Commission, for the past 10 years, I've actually written the budget. There are two bills which fund the Auditor General. One is a transfer bill, the other is an appropriation bill. And I've carried and passed those in the House and Senate this past decade, so I have a very thorough knowledge of most, if not all, of the $29 million operating budget. There are 81 employees, 9 of which are centered in Chicago, the rest are Springfield-based, who are highly accredited professionals. In a peer-to-peer audit, which means other states coming in and looking at our Auditor General, they have never had a finding. They've had perfect reviews. And I hope to continue that work and that level of quality that's been set forward by Mr. Holland and his tremendous staff.
As what might be obvious, you know a lot about what functions here in state government, not only because you've been in the legislature for 25 years, but just as you mentioned, you're the guy that lifts the hood and see where the dollars are going, and you know the budget probably as well as anyone around, if not probably the most of anyone around, aside from maybe the budget director. What do you make as we stand here? And here we are in this unprecedented period of time with no budget. What's your reaction and thoughts as based both upon your knowledge of the budget and your knowledge of politics in Illinois?
I've written and done a lot of work on the past 5 budgets. Now this year we don't have one, but the 4 previous budget we paid down $6 billion in old bills, funded the basic services utilizing a tax increase that went away on here, and that's created some of the problem. I think the governor understands that. He'd like to see some changes, but I think over the last few days you've seen some movement from the governor's office towards not dealing with some of the non-economic issues. The biggest problem that we have facing us is our budget, and it is the revenues, part of the holes which were created when the tax went away. There's going to have to be a blended approach, which means more taxes of some type, which would be agreeable to both parties, and cuts into governmental operations, which would be agreeable to both parties. And I think that's the important thing that we really need to get to. I've never in the 25 years seen an impasse that lasted this long over non-budgetary items. And so it's really time, and I was happy to see some movement today on unemployment insurance, on the determination of need scores. Those are all very important issues because they're pressure points on accomplishing what has to happen in order for the state to run properly.
I believe the governor's office just the other day also raised the level that they had set. They had taken the child care provisions, didn't they raise that back to, I believe it was like 186% of 65%.
Which then takes out a lot of the people who would have been denied access. So that's a significant movement that I think is appropriate. And we'll go forward. I think there'll still be legislation today which would put statutory language in place as opposed to rules to ensure that those in need receive their coverage. But it's something where you can see a level of agreement.
Just because you're a wealth of knowledge of history of the last 25 years, how would you compare this standoff to the one I remember that might be somewhat similar? It seemed more poisonous to me back in 2007 when Governor Blagojevich was in office.
The never-ending summer.
The never-ending summer.
I find that some of the new, that occurred with a very young Blagojevich administration, and it was nearly as toxic as some of the new Rauner administration responses had been early on. So I do see a lot of similarities to our endless summer. However, during that time there were meetings going on. This time what is different, so there have been no meetings since May. And that, I think, that's a failure of leadership when you don't have anyone talking and you can see collateral damage throughout the state that's having to be taken care of on a piecemeal basis, crisis to crisis, as opposed to actually meeting and getting it done.
I don't know.
Concentrating on budgetary issues.
I asked Governor Edgar recently if he thought some of the standoff was due to the fact that Governor Rauner had not held political office before and just hadn't maybe understood some of the political process that you have to go through as compared to running a business. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is my fifth governor, and with any governor and new administration coming in, there's a learning curve. This one was made more difficult because of the early decisions. The governor asked that the tax increase from Governor Quinn not be extended. That created a $3.5 billion hole. He did not submit a budget which was balanced for consideration, and vetoed the unbalanced budget sent from the legislature. So all these combined to make the perfect storm. You have a very new, very young administration staffed with many people who came from federal governments and from other states that were not familiar with the problems specific to Illinois and what they could and couldn't actually legally do. Hence all the court decisions which are driving the spending without a budget in place, which is probably the saddest statement here, is the courts are driving them and no one is holding check on the courts. You could have negotiated a different outcome for savings of dollars or gotten the leaders together and negotiated.
The Democratic budget that was passed in May, the budget that was passed in May, was $4 billion short. Aren't we going to spend more than $4 billion out of whack now with the court orders?
With the court orders, what has happened is you are now paying things out at a higher level because of previous years. So the governor's rules that came into place that lowered the rates of payment are no longer in place. So without an agreement or talks, you're paying out at a higher level, so yes.
We won't keep you too much longer, but what would be your prescription, would you say, as you, again, knowing the budget more than anything else? Was it a mistake not to have the 5% be permanent? And do you think the 5% tax that we had before, does that make Illinois non-competitive?
I don't think it makes Illinois non-competitive. If the level is 5%, my assumption would be it is lower. It would be lower than that, simply because at the time Governor Quinn was still in office prior to the
Are you
passage.
saying, sorry, just to clarify, your presumption would be when you say it would be lower, you mean if they raise it?
If they raise it, it would not go back to the 5% level. Things were doable at a level a half a point less to a quarter point less under Governor Quinn. Some things have changed, but not that much. The Democratic budget contained $400 million in cuts. There could easily be agreed upon cuts at a much higher level. So there's room to negotiate. I would say that if they talked budget items only, the budget would be a very simple thing to get aligned to keep state services.
So it would be a combination of new revenue.
Which would be taxes and cuts.
And where would the cut? Would we cut education? I mean, education is one of the big education and healthcare
are one of the big items. And yes, when you're doing that, there are certain programs which would have to take cuts. And until the last day or until you're at the negotiating table, there's no reason to offer those up beforehand as targets. So when you get into serious negotiations, I think both sides know what level of cuts are doable and the corresponding taxes or types of taxes to make those numbers match. It's not that difficult. It's been put to the side by non-budgetary issues, because normally a couple of years ago we'd have had that budget done in about 45 minutes.
As we stand here on the 10th of November, if you looked into your crystal ball, what would be your best guess of when Illinois would have a budget?
I really don't have a best guess for it. I think the governor will probably give a 2017 budget address without a 2016 budget. That's coming up here in 3 weeks, or excuse me, not 3 weeks, but in February, third week of February. So my guess is there will be a budget that'll be passed requiring 60 votes and then a time lag between it. So I don't see a new budget prior to the budget address.
All right, well, Frank Mautino, as you leave the House and enter your new position, we wish you all the best of luck. You're one of the really good guys in the Capitol, and I'll say for the audience, someone who's respected by members on both sides of the aisle.
Well, thank you. I've been blessed to serve the people of LaSalle Bureau and Putnam County for many years here. I've worked with tremendous people on both sides of the aisle and had the Auditor General. The only thing that could have taken me from the House of Representatives was the Auditor General, a man I greatly respect, resigning, because I've loved the opportunities to work here and work with some wonderful people. And I've enjoyed our time together in many of the specials and budgetary items that you and I have talked about. So thank you for your service.
Thank you, Frank. Take care.